Hi, everybody. Hello and welcome, and thank you for joining us for Constitution Day. My name is Malia Cromer, and I'm the director of the UMBC Institute of Politics. I'm also a professor in the political science department. Our mission at the IOP is to produce and support public-facing scholarship and student-centered events and research that help bridge the gap between the community and the politics of the state and localities surrounding us with students here on campus. I think that inviting a Maryland State Senator, welcome, Senator Smith, really fits the bill and is perfectly aligned with the mission of the IOP, and it certainly speaks to the importance of Constitution Day. Before Dr. Blake, an associate professor of political science who actually teaches constitutional law, if you're interested, he'll be offering it next semester. I'd like to invite up Dr. Eric Stokan, who is the director of our Center for Social Science Scholarship, to say a few words about where this event that we have put on year after year contributes to both the work of CS3 as well as the broader College of Arts, Humanities, and Social Sciences. Eric?
Hi, everyone. Welcome. Thank you for being here today. Just want to say a few brief remarks. So first, very glad to see all of you here today. My name is Eric Stoke, and I'm the director of the Center for Social Science Scholarship and an associate professor of political science. At CS3, I have the distinct honor to help to organize the Social Science Forum lecture series, to which Constitution Day is a part. This distinguished lecture series has actually been around for more than 25 years now. It just celebrated its 25th anniversary last year, and it has featured 2 Nobel Prize winners, a special assistant to the U.S. president, a trade ambassador, and world-renowned faculty and public servants. I'm very glad to have you join this list, Senator Smith. Thank you so much for being here and for kicking off the SSF for the 25-26 academic year. Our next Social Science Forum lecture will take place here in the Library Gallery on Thursday, October 16th at 4 p.m. The Department of Gender, Women's, and Sexuality Studies will host their annual Joan Kornman Lecture. The talk is titled Migrant Ecologies, Plant Worlds, and the Afterlives of Empire. You can learn more about the SSF series, its history, and this talk by visiting socialscience.umbc.edu. I'd also invite you to join the Center for Social Science Scholarship on LinkedIn, Blue Sky, Facebook, Instagram, whatever social media platform you're on these days. And you can do that at UMBC SOC SCI. Finally, I'd like to thank my colleague, Dr. Malia Cromer, and the Institute of Politics for organizing this event today, as well as the Department of Political Science and the Center for Democracy and Civic Life for co-sponsoring it. And of course, thank you again to all of you for joining today. I will now turn things over to my colleague, Dr. William Blake, Associate Professor of the Department of Political Science, to introduce our distinguished speaker. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Eric, and thank you for all the good work that CS3 does for UMBC. On this date, 238 years ago, the Constitutional Convention concluded with delegates from 12 states signing a new framework of government. Anyone remember who the missing 13th state was? Was it Rhode Island? It was Rhode Island. I'm very disappointed in all of you. Ours is the longest lasting constitution in the history of the world, and it isn't even close. Across the globe, national constitutions last, on average, 19 years before being replaced, leading some scholars to argue that the endurance of the US Constitution is as inexplicable as the physical endurance of Jeanne Calment, a French woman who lived to the ripe old age of 120, despite smoking and drinking every day and eating 2 pounds of chocolate every week. Constitution and Citizenship Day was created by an act of Congress in 1952. In 2004, Senator Robert Byrd passed legislation mandating that all educational institutions that receive federal funding hold educational programming about the U.S. Constitution on September 17th, this date precisely, which rather limits our scheduling options. And we are very fortunate that our speaker for Constitution and Citizenship Day was able to make room in his busy schedule to join us here at UMBC. William C. Smith Jr. was elected to represent Montgomery County in the Maryland House of Delegates in 2015 before joining the Maryland Senate in late 2016. He has served as chair of the Judicial Procedures Committee since 2020. Senator Smith was raised in Silver Spring, but I must say he made an excellent decision to attend the College of William and Mary, where he and I both graduated with a degree in government in 2004. Senator Smith also earned a master's in government from Johns Hopkins University, a JD from the Marshall Wythe School of Law at William and Mary, and a master's of science of strategic intelligence from the National Intelligence University. Senator Smith has a long record of serving his community and his country, including graduating from AmeriCorps' Project Change to working as an intelligence officer in the U.S. Navy Reserve. He served in Afghanistan in the NATO-led Operation Resolute Support in 2019, and he's earned the National Defense Service Medal, Global War on Terrorism Service Medal, Joint Meritorious Unit Award, and Joint Service Achievement Award. From 2011 to 2013, Senator Smith was the director of the Homeland Security Advisory Council, which provides expert advice to the Secretary of Homeland Security on national security issues. A quick formatting note, students, if you have not already done so, make sure you sign yourself in before you leave. If your professors have offered extra credit, we have lots and lots of food, so if you haven't eaten, grab some food on the way out. We will hear some opening remarks from the senator before convening a student panel for a question and answer session. So without any further ado, will you please join me in welcoming Senator Will Smith?
I'm surprised and glad that there were no Will Smith jokes, but how are you all doing this afternoon? How are you doing politically? Just thinking about the political environment, how are you all doing? Is everything okay? Yeah, I hear you. Look, I was thinking about this, and I wrote this down when we were during the speech. I was thinking, in the last couple of years, we've had Nancy Pelosi, had the break-in her home, and her husband was assaulted. You've had 2 assassination attempts on the president's life. Governor Shapiro's, the mansion was broken into, set afire. The former Speaker of the Minnesota House and her husband, another member of their House of Delegates, was assassinated. The CEO of United Healthcare, and then also, Charlie Kirk last week. And I just want to thank you all for engaging in constructive dialogue, peaceful dialogue, but the free exchange of ideas is really important. And I was discussing this with my mother, who's now 81 years old, last night. And I was like, hey, have you ever, you remember a time like this? And she said, yeah. She's like, the 60s. The 60s were exactly like this. And everyone from John F. Kennedy, Medgar Evers, Malcolm X, Bobby Kennedy, and so on. And I said, well, how did you get through it? How did the country get through it? What was the mood like? And she just said, look, just remember, hone back, fall back on your core fundamental values that, look, there's a lot amongst us that unites us, and we have a lot of commonalities. And if you can start that dialogue there, then you can have a free exchange of ideas, an aggressive exchange of ideas without reverting to violence. And so I think days like today are actually really important. And so I just want to thank all of you as students who are leaning forward and engaged in the free exchange of ideas for being part of this process. And so I just want to say, just before we get into the mix of the speech, I just wanted to say that. I thought I had to say that because I've been thinking a lot about just kind of the political discourse and the environment that we're all in, and the environment that you are in the middle of and are going to inherit and lead in a few short years when you leave this institution. So from me to you, thank you for that at the top. Look, I want to say thank you for the invitation to join you on this occasion, obviously commemorating the signing of the Constitution in 1787. And I was actually very excited about joining a program like this, and to hear that this program was still so vibrant on campus, because you think about this. There are roughly 49 million immigrants in the United States, many of whom have become citizens. And you all know how the naturalization process works. You go through, you take a citizenship test. It's a universe of about 100 questions, of which you will be given 10, of which you must answer 6 correctly. And 91% of people that are applying for citizenship pass the test on the first try. Now, that same test was given to 3.5 million Americans across the country, random sampling. And in only one state, Vermont, could a majority of people pass on the first try. And so whenever you have a program that speaks to the Constitution and American history, I'm all for it, and I'm glad that you all are leaning forward and having this exchange of ideas and this conversation today. So I thank you for this. Today, I'm going to frame my remarks around my experience as a state legislator, so a state senator, and even more particularly as the chairman of the Judicial Proceedings Committee in the Maryland State Senate. In the Maryland State Senate, we have 4 standing committees. I'm chair of one. Our jurisdiction is all of the criminal and civil law, transportation, and housing. So I wanted to do that to give you my perspective on the Constitution, and in particularly the 10th Amendment, from my standpoint as a state legislator. And even more specifically, this is not a political speech, and so I'm not going to make any political pronouncements about where I stand on issues, although I think it'll become pretty clear through my speech, is that through the frame of immigration and immigration enforcement and the interplay between the federal government and what the states are doing across the country, and the influence that the federal government is trying to exert on the states, and is particularly in the state legislature, to enforce immigration. Because I think it's a very topical thing, and it draws together a lot of discordant threads of the Constitution and our role here on the state level. Now, today in Maryland, you may or may not know that 7 counties, it's Cecil, Frederick, Hartford, Carroll, Garrett, St. Mary's, and Washington counties have something called the 287G program. They've enrolled in the 287G program, which is a program that was actually created in the 90s under the Clinton administration. And that allows for local entities to engage and be deputized, get training and support to help enforce immigration laws throughout the country. And so those 7 counties in Maryland have gone ahead and enrolled in that program since the current administration took place. Those are obviously voluntary programs, but I want to talk to you and speak to some of the things that may not be so voluntary. There's a lot of talk, and not idle talk, about the federalization of resources and assets to go ahead and enforce federal immigration. So I think that's a good place it's topical, and it also ties together the 10th Amendment and the framing of our system of federalism in the United States. Now, obviously, the Constitution, and Professor, you correct me if I say anything wrong, but the Constitution was only ratified after the Federalists. And have you all read the Federalist Papers and the Anti-Federalist Papers? Great conversations back and forth about how we were going to set up our government. But the Constitution was only ratified after the Federalists promised that there would be amendments to the Constitution and changes. It's the only way they were able to get it through. And the first 10 amendments are the Bill of Rights. Yes, so the Bill of Rights. And so one of the changes that many of the states and the delegates wanted and demanded was that that there would be an affirmation that the federal government would be one of limited and enumerated powers, because they were obviously skeptical of a strong centralized government that was disconnected from them dictating them, because they just fought a revolution to get rid of such a structure. And so the 10th Amendment, I think, is a nice place to start, especially for a state legislator, to understand the structure of federalism in the United States. And so it reaffirms that basic structure that the Constitution and the government is going to be one of, again, limited and enumerated powers, and that all other powers are reserved to the states and the people. And so that's a very important pronouncement for how government is structured. And again, it sets forth that structure. It helps define that relationship between what the folks in Washington are doing and what we do here or what I do in Annapolis. And I also think about that in the context of a pocket of 3 amendments that came after the Civil War, because while the 10th Amendment sets up this kind of tiered system of federalism, separation and federalism, after the Civil War, the 13th, the 14th, and 15th Amendments were passed. And those amendments kind of reach to the states from the federal government and say, we're going to protect our citizens. So the 13th Amendment saying no slavery, the 14th Amendment, due process, birthright citizenship, equal protection, all those things say we're reaching in. The federal government's going to say that we are going to protect the citizens, the residents in the states. And then obviously the 15th Amendment, which gave universal suffrage to all men, not women. But that's an important interplay again of the federal government kind of expanding its power to protect citizens, but that doesn't run afoul of the 10th Amendment, because the 10th Amendment speaks to enumerated powers, and these are all enumerated and enshrined into the Constitution. So it's an interesting conversation that happens between what the federal government's doing and what the states can and will do in their operations. So there is a natural tension there, but not with those three amendments. But I use that just to kind of talk about, to elucidate that conversation that happens. And so with that foundation and background, I want to talk more specifically even about the anti-commandeering clause, or what's become to be known as the anti-commandeering clause in the 10th Amendment, or the doctrine. It prevents federal government from forcing state and local governments to enact or enforce federal laws or programs. This is particularly important to me as a state legislator, especially if there's an adversarial nature between, or a huge departure in politics and policy and philosophy between what's happening in the federal government and what's happening in some of the states, which in Maryland there is. Again, I'm not giving a political speech. I'm just kind of framing where we are politically and constitutionally. And so this principle of federalism holds that the federal government cannot commandeer state legislative processes or compel state officials to carry out federal regulatory programs, ensuring that states can manage their own affairs without being coerced into serving federal mandates. And the history there is actually quite recent for the contemporary understanding of what the anti-commandeering clause does. And the first seminal case there, if you take this constitutional law class, you are going to hear about New York versus the United States. You're going to hear about the Prince case. So the New York case comes down in 1992. President Bill Clinton is in office at the time, just newly sworn in. And the courts held that the states may not commandeer state regulatory processes by ordering states to enact or administer a federal regulatory program limited by congressional power. And Sandra Day O'Connor, Justice O'Connor, who was the first woman to serve on the court, she said that at first it makes no difference whether federalism constraints derive from the 10th Amendment or instead from a lack of power delegated to Congress under Article 1. So it's got to be enumerated. It's kind of like a foot stomp of the enumerated powers thing. And then second, she said essentially that the political process can't expand these as well. It's meaning that because your federal representative from Congress, from the House of Representatives, or from the Senate voted to pass this type of expansion, that doesn't make it permissible. So there are two kind of pronouncements in the New York case. And then second, in 1997, 5 years later, the Prince case comes out, and it says that extending the principle applied in New York, the Prince versus the United States, the court held that Congress may not circumvent the prohibition on commandeering a state's regulatory process by conscripting state officers directly. And so do you remember you may not remember this, but I think we may not have been born. And when Ronald Reagan was shot, his press secretary, Brady, was paralyzed in that exchange. Fun fact, my cousin, Danny Spriggs, was the first African-American to head presidential detail eventually. He was there. He's the guy with like the mini fro. If you replay this thing, he's the guy with the mini fro with the pistol in the air and standing on Conley. So anyway, that when Brady becomes paralyzed, his family, they move into action for gun control and regulation. And his wife helps lead this effort, and they pass the Brady Act. And so this case challenges an aspect of that law that was passed, and that aspect was that the law required states to state local officials and law enforcement officials to run background checks on people purchasing handguns, but it required the state to do it. And so the court noted that the federal government may neither issue directives requiring the states to address particular problems, nor command the state's officers to administer or enforce a federal regulatory program. So now you have these other strains. You have with the anti-commandeering clause. You have now the Supreme Court is saying that, listen, you can't even. Not only can you not tell them what to do, but you can't use their local law enforcement officers or their local officials to administer a federal directive. So there's a clear, again, separation that the 10th Amendment is laying out and the anti-commandeering clause is laying out. This all becomes very important in the state legislature when we're talking about immigration policy, but a number of other things as well. We're using immigration policy today, but it's interesting and fascinating to understand what this conversation has evolved into over the last 30 or so years in particular. Next case I'll talk about is the National Federation of Independent Businesses versus Sebelius, or NFIB. NFIB, basically, when you go back to look at what New York and Prince said, they observed that Congress may attach conditions to federal funds dispersed under its spending clause power, thereby avoiding any anti-commandeering problems. Meaning that, okay, we can't control your instrumentalities, we can't tell you what to do, but you know what we can do? We can withhold funding unless you do what we tell you to do. And so then the court has to figure out, well, what are the left and right guidelines of that power? What are the restrictions on the spending clause powers? And so that's what this NFIB case essentially did. The court's decision explored those limitations, and it involved a constitutional challenge in particular to the Patent Protection and Affordable Care Act, the ACA. And that there was a portion of that legislation that said, hey, we're going to cut off your Medicaid unless you expand this program. And so what the court did, they came back and said, look, Justice Roberts wrote that the distinction between permissible conditions and impermissible commandeering collapses when the state has no choice in whether to accept the conditions. So the states argued, and then the court agreed that the Medicaid expansion conditions on noncompliance did not offer the states a choice in the matter, and therefore was akin to the type of coercion that was forbidden in Prince and New York. So you're setting some guidelines. That's why this is an important case to kind of understand, because when Congress tries to circumvent anti-commandeering and circumvent the restrictions in the 10th Amendment, they use spending clause powers, but then now there's some guardrails on what that looks like. And then finally, we can go on to this case, Murphy versus the NCAA, which was in 2018. In that case, Samuel Alito, writing on behalf of the court, invalidated on anti-commandeering grounds the provision in the Professional and Amateur Sports Protection Act that prohibited states from authorizing sports gambling schemes. So he said, look, he looked at Prince and he looked at New York, and he said that Congress lacks the power to issue orders directly to the states, and the court concluded that the Act's prohibition on state authorization on sports gambling violated the anti-commandeering rule by putting state legislators under the direct control of Congress. That was in 2018, which is interesting too, because Maryland went through this. I mean, we went through a very vigorous debate in implementing sports betting, and a lot of it was hanging in the balance until after this 2018 case came down. So like another interesting way that affected our policy is we were one of the states that wanted to move forward with sports betting because it was a good source of revenue generation, even though I wasn't particularly involved in that debate, but I was in the legislature when it happened. So with that as the basis, you've got some just very high-level understanding of the 10th Amendment, the anti-commandeering clause, and the conversation that's happened back and forth and how the Supreme Court has wrestled with it. So I want to kind of bring it back down to the state legislative level, which is where I sit, and some of the conversations that we've had in Annapolis. So obviously, we talked about the 7 jurisdictions that have the 287G program. That's a voluntary program, completely allowed. The question is then, are there other methods by which the federal government will look to commandeer or utilize state resources to effectuate some of their policy prerogatives with regard to immigration? And the reason why I talk about that, because it's certainly going to come up in the next legislative session, as it did last legislative session. Now, everyone has a cursory understanding of what that 287G program is, and I talked a little bit about it at the top. So during the first Trump administration, again, this is not a political speech, I was in the legislature, I was in the Senate, I was chair of the Judicial Proceedings Committee. I had 2 pieces of legislation that I authored. One would restrict all potential 287G programs to what we call a detention center model, meaning that only correctional officers could implement it. It was still voluntary. But we didn't want field enforcement. We didn't want our state and local law enforcement officers going out asking people for your papers, asking people questions like, where were you born, out on the street. And noting that that has no effect whatever on what ICE does, because that's a federal agency. They can come in and do whatever they want if they have the requisite either judicial warrant or administrative ICE detainer, which we'll talk a little bit about it as well. But we said in Maryland, we're not going to participate in field enforcement. So that was my piece of legislation that we passed through successfully. I also authored a piece of legislation, and we passed it and implemented it, that said we're not going to use our detention facilities, our jails, or our prisons to subsidize this practice of housing people that were going to go through the immigration deportation process. We weren't going to use our jails and our prisons for that process. We weren't going to let ICE park people here, okay? And because you get money for it, and I thought it created a perverse incentive for prisons and local localities to get federal money for housing these folks that were going through this process. So we got rid of that. So now you know where I stand on this issue. But so move forward to this iteration of the Trump administration, and things are just moving a lot more quickly. Things are a lot more fluid. They're moving with much greater efficiency, and it is causing a lot of consternation and I think lack of clarity as to where some of the constitutional limits are on some of these things. And so next session, I already know legislation is coming to get rid of 287G programs. Fine, that's a voluntary program. But there will also be legislation that deals with the National Guard. Under what authorities can the National Guard be federalized by the president instead of having the governor be the commander-in-chief of those forces? It depends on what type of authorities are exercised, but there will be legislation trying to constrict that. So all these questions are going to be before us in the next legislative session, and I thought that the 10th Amendment, again, frames the relationship, or at least the structure of federalism and what we can and cannot do quite nicely. And so I thought this was a good blend of citizenship, a good blend of the exchange between the local state governments and the federal government, but then also a dose of constitutional law. You got 4 cases that kind of help you understand what the 10th Amendment means and what the anti-commandeering clause means. And so, we will continue to move forward entertaining those things and trying to understand where those lines, where they lie. I'll conclude with this. I have been in the Senate since 2016. I have never seen the level of questioning and understanding of what it means to be in the state legislature when you have kind of an adversarial nature in the White House than the last 2 years. It's just been it's been an interesting experience. I'll put it that way. And again, if we go forward and we, let's say, create sanctuary cities or sanctuary jurisdictions, or we get rid of the 287G program, there have been very clear articulation from the White House that they're going to cut off resources from the state. Now, does that mean that the Francis Scott Key Bridge doesn't get funded? Does that mean that there are going to be further cuts to Medicaid to Maryland? Does that mean that SNAP benefits are going to go farther down? What does it mean? Does it mean transportation dollars aren't going to flow? Does it mean that community development block grants are not going to be here? That's the president's prerogative to make those pronouncements, to ensure that the policies that half of Americans voted for get implemented throughout the states. What is our responsibility as Marylanders to fight back if we disagree? And so that's why the spending clause and the limitations on the spending clause are actually kind of important for you to think about as well in this context. And so with that, we have a lot of open questions for the next legislative session. I'm really honored to be here with you. I'm looking forward to the discussion. And again, I'll just end where I started off. Thank you all for willing to lean in and have constructive dialogue. Lean on each other. We will be okay. We are going to be better off in the long run, but only if you do this together. So keep having ideas, keep having those late night arguments in your dorm, like we did in William and Mary, after maybe a few too many beers, but keep talking to each other, and keep the exchange open. So with that, I'll say thank you very much, and I'm looking forward to the discussion.
Okay. Thank you so much, Senator Smith, for being a really great lesson in constitutional law. Did you approve, William? Absolutely. Okay, good.
You covered some stuff that I could fit on the slide, so thank you. Yeah.
It's really good. Thank you. Okay, so I'd like to invite our student panelists up to the front.
Thank you so much for being with us today, Senator. My first question is, last session, I know you co-sponsored Senate Bill 422, which would have raised the age at which a child could be tried as an adult from 14 to 16 for certain crimes. Looking ahead, what steps or changes do you think will be necessary to get this bill passed in the next session?
All right. So thank you for the question. Just for context, so in Maryland, we charge more youths as adults than per capita than every other state except for Alabama, and 85% of those youths that are charged as adults ultimately either get their case dismissed or they get transferred back down to the juvenile system. So you waste a lot of time and money if you charge these offenses as adults at the first blush. That doesn't mean that you can't charge them as adults once they're in the juvenile system. A judge can always waive them up. But when you are in the adult system, you don't have access to treatment or any programming, any access to education, and you're also exposed to adults in prison, which constitutionally you're not. There has to be sight and sound separation if you're a youth in an adult system, and we don't have the capacity to do that. So we run afoul of that every year, every day, every month. So it just makes no sense to do it that way, and it's also very expensive. The fiscal note said that we'd save $17 million a year if we just started them in a system that would give them resources and access to education to get out of that cycle that they're in so that they don't recidivate. And so to my mind, it's even if you're not moved by the kind of the social justice piece or like the humanitarian piece, some of these crimes are terrible. I mean, I think you have to look that in the eye. Like some of the crimes that some of these youths have committed are heinous. But if you view this through a lens of just efficiency, like getting better public safety outcomes, saving money, reinvesting that money into the system so that you could have more of a prospective look, meaning that you could do violence interruption and prevent things from happening before they do, it's just a better way to run. Like you wouldn't run your company like that, and you shouldn't run government like that, but these are actual real lives at stake. So I thought that it made a lot of sense. It is a first step, and I'm going to reintroduce it again this next coming session. I actually went out, there were two, and this is a long answer, but I think it's actually kind of important for this. It's interesting, or at least I think so. But there is, I had an opportunity to go out to a grave site in Prince George's County at Cheltenham, which is one of the youth detention facilities, and learn about the history. I thought there were 80 bodies in unmarked graves there. We now know there are close to 300. And these are children that died in the custody of the state, and they were buried in unmarked graves. This graveyard's all overgrown and no headstones. I mean, there's a Washington Post article about it that we can send along, and a couple of articles in NPR that covered this. But the point is, it forced us to look at the history of how we handle juvenile justice in Maryland. And these detention facilities, one was created for black boys, one was created for white boys. One was called rehabilitation and reformation. One was thought had a much more correction, and kind of more of a punitive name to it. And they were separate facilities until they were desegregated after Juanita Jackson Mitchell was the first African American woman to be barred in Maryland, and Thurgood Marshall fought to desegregate these two facilities. They were still horribly run. They weren't like model facilities or anything, but at least they were desegregated and there was more equal treatment. But I think there's a direct nexus between that history and kind of the practices that we're engaged in today, though with less overt animus. And so, but the product is different. So we charge more youths as adults than almost every other state in the nation except for one. And 9 out of 10 of those children are children of color. 8 out of 10 are black children. So the disparities are just baked in, and I think this is a good way to address a multitude of structural problems that we have in our juvenile justice system.
Thank you so much for that.
Thank you so much, Senator Smith, for being here. As the chair of the Judicial Proceedings Committee in the Senate, what is your philosophy on building consensus on the most contentious issues facing our state and our nation, like among your committees, on the committee, and throughout your own party?
Yeah, people are checking out already, man. And I'm kidding. I'm kidding. I'm just getting food. They're getting food. No, no. So in the jurisdiction of the committee, I think is really important, and it actually it's refreshing in a sense because you kind of get away from the politics. It's not really a partisan place, honestly. I mean, obviously, like your political philosophy informs where you're going to be on certain pieces of legislation, but when you're looking at it, it's not partisan. I mean, most of the legislation that comes out of the committee is almost unanimous or close to, and so that's one thing that's refreshing. But I think you have to. When I first ran for office, there was a council person in Tacoma Park that said, "Hey, listen, you're going to have the power to convene people if you ever get elected to things, and you're going to." So I think it's important first, to have a good vision of like where you want to take things. Second is you got to convene people to help you make good decisions. I'd say you have to be radically inclusive when you convene people because a lot of times, people that are most impacted or most adversely impacted by policy don't have the ability to come down or don't have the know-it-all or wherewithal or the availability, frankly, to come down to Annapolis and lobby for change. They don't have the ability to petition their government that some other folks might have. So you have to be radically inclusive. You've got to look to your left and right, figure out who's not at the table, bring those people into the discussion, and move forward. And then have a feedback cycle. Like, don't take criticism personally because it'll prevent you from taking it seriously. Like, make sure you're listening to what your constituents are saying, what other people are saying. And I think when you do that, you kind of put the politics out of it and you kind of just do things on the merits. And that's mostly what happens in the committee.
Thank you.
Is this working? Okay, so my question for you, Senator Smith, is what first put you on the path to a career in public service? Was there a particular policy issue that motivated you, or perhaps a specific problem in your community that inspired you to work in politics?
No, so actually, look, I'm a first generation college student. So my dad was a cab driver. Mom worked for GSA for like 40 years. And it's funny story. When I went down to William and Mary, my dad was a cab driver, and then he did limousines, which was kind of cool because you could get I got autographs. And forgive me, I grew up as a Commanders fan, or then was known as the Redskins fan because I was in Washington D.C. and the Ravens didn't even exist. Okay, come on, all right. But I was an O's fan because the Nats didn't exist. So I'm from Montgomery County, you gotta remember. He, Doug Williams, Ernest Binder. I got a Thompson, a Charles Mann, I got an autograph. I mean, these are awesome. Yeah, see, we're connecting on this. So that was a cool part. But no political. I didn't have a political family or anything. And it was funny because when I went down to William Mary, there was a guy who was very political, and his name was Willie Jolly. Do you remember that name? He was a year behind us, but his dad was a motivational speaker and had a book called "A Setback is a Setup for a Comeback." Anyway, my dad was his driver, and he was a year behind us. So I'm at school, and then this guy comes up. He shows up, this really boisterous guy, and he's like, "Yeah, man, I'm Willie Jolly." I'm like, "Wait, my dad used to drive your dad." So it's just interesting to show you how things work out, but. My dad also we had two newspapers that came to the house. One was the Afro from Baltimore, and then one was the Washington Post. And my dad had a habit of just cutting out articles and reading them to me, which I hated because I just wanted to take my girlfriend to the movies or whatever. I wanted to get out of the house. I was always asking for $20 or something. But he made me sit down and he read these things. And when he was done, he would put them on a bulletin board. And so he started this when I was in middle school. And so over the course of years, this bulletin board was thick with articles. And unfortunately, so my dad passed away in 2006 when I was my first week of law school. I came back to the house and I remember walking to the room where that bulletin board was. And each one of those articles, inch thick, was like a conversation. All those conversations were about either some sort of African-American achievement in academia or politics, or politics, international politics, domestic politics. And I think when you take a step back, you kind of realize when people were kind of helping you and guiding you in ways that you don't even realize. And that's certainly where I think I got my interest in politics, was just from sitting down with my dad reading these articles over the course of years. So it wasn't a particular issue. It was just more of a being close to DC, but then also having a dad that was force feeding me politics from a very young age.
Thank you for sharing.
My question, Senator, is what do you think are the greatest threats to American democracy today? And what are some specific things that state governments can do to solve these challenges?
giant existential question. I think internationally we are in a much more perilous environment than I think a lot of folks. I'm still in the Navy Reserves as an intelligence officer. Right now I serve at Fort Meade in an AFRICOM unit, which is there are 54 nations in Africa, so it's responsible for that situation. But and then before that, I was in CENTCOM, which is where all of the world's fires are at the moment. But if you think about drilling down from just where we are with Gaza, Israel, Syria, Ukraine, Russia, Taiwan, China, there are several active hot wars in Africa right now. You got 1.6 billion people there, 54 countries, and I think there are at least 20 active conflicts going on. So internationally, I think we're in a very interesting and perilous environment. Domestically, I think we are in a place where you are in virtually unprecedented. I hate that word, but I mean you are seeing a lot of strain on the system that you haven't seen in a very, very long time, and I think Congress, like the traditional institutions we talk about in the 10th Amendment, but like you think about the institutions like the Article 1 and 2 and 3, like they're supposed to be these are all equal branches, and there's supposed to be a strong interplay of checks and balances. And when you have two branches that are seemingly acquiescing to the will of one of the executive branch, I think you are in a space where you're not seeing those traditional checks and balances, that conversation between and that struggle. And I think you can veer into some very dangerous territory. So and not for political reasons, it's not a political speech, but if the first step you could take to restore some semblance of balance would be to flip the House or flip the Senate, flip Congress, so that Congress is more actively engaged in challenging and pushing back on the executive. Because if you have this, you probably study unitary executive theory or you probably study that and what people are thinking about when they're expanding executive power. So I think, and again, not political, but if you wanted to restore some balance, I think you got to capture Congress back and have that vigorous conversation that the framers wanted us to have in the federal government. And you have checks on foreign policy too.
Okay, my next question for you, it's a bit of a long one, is over the past few years, there has been a push, both nationally and in some states, to roll back diversity and inclusion programs at public institutions. Supporters of these initiatives argue that bringing together people from different backgrounds leads to a broader range of perspectives and ultimately more effective solutions. Maryland has one of the highest percentages of Black lawmakers, about 29%, serving in its state legislature. In addition, House Speaker Adrienne A. Jones is the first Black woman to serve that role in Maryland. Do you think this representation has shaped the state's legislative agenda? And can you point to a policy that might not have gained traction without those voices in the room?
So, yes, I think it has had a tremendous impact on where we've gone policy-wise. And I think those are core values that are within that we've put in as a legislature, from even how we view every piece of legislation and what type of impact does it have on certain communities. There's an equity lens that goes through that, procurement, but also social justice policy. A number of those things wouldn't have been passed but for the activism of the Black Caucus in particular, but also of a diverse set of lawmakers. But even forgetting like the Black, white, or LGBTQ plus IA or hetero, forget all the differences. I think when you have more people from just from ethnic backgrounds, racial backgrounds, all sorts of diversity, geographic, socioeconomic, all of those things actually help better policymaking. So, when you have an assault on like DEI, it's all of us, like it's kind of everybody, because everyone will fall into some sliver of that definition. And so, I'm glad we're in Maryland. I'm glad we have a legislature that's leaning forward with some of those policies. You also have the first Black governor this year. You have the first Black attorney general, the first Black speaker, first black woman speaker, first woman to be a speaker. So you've got a lot of firsts that are coming. First woman to be elected statewide, not for federal office in Brooke Learman. First Asian American to be the lieutenant governor. I mean, so you've got all of this like rich diversity that's, I think, beautiful thing, and it's going to make for better policy.
My second question is, so like survey work by Pew Research and among others shows that like public trust in government, including state and federal government or local government, has been steadily declining since the 1960s. Is there anything that you can do at the state level to build that public trust kind of back?
I think in Maryland, we have a pretty good track record in terms of transparency, in terms of the legislative process. So you can stream it gavel to gavel, you can stream it online. The records are accessible. We have good campaign finance laws. And so those things are good. I think it comes down more just to the folks that do run for office. I mean, like, you shouldn't run for office if you hadn't lived a righteous lifestyle before you ran for office. That's just fine, because you'll have an election to get you there, and that'll come out in the wash. But you really do need to have like a righteous living style when you're elected to office, because there's a lot of scrutiny there, and I think that's rightfully so, because a public office is a public trust. I work for all of you, and when someone breaks that trust through stealing or any other nefarious act or bribery or something, or some element of political corruption, that breaks down trust not only in the institution but in all of government. And I think that's why I personally think like public corruption is the worst, because you spend so much time trying to build trust in institutions, and it only takes a couple of small incidents to kind of infuse cynicism into everyone, and then people will get mad, and people don't think it works. There's no cooperation. Government is certainly not the answer to all solutions, but it certainly can facilitate answers to a lot of societal problems. So I don't know what more Maryland could do in particular, but I do think it's a very serious problem when it does happen, and I think Maryland has some pretty good laws for transparency and accountability.
First of all, thank you so much to the panelists. Those are really great questions. I really appreciate it, guys. And that really concludes what we're doing here for Constitution Day. I can't thank Senator Smith enough. I'm looking forward very much to seeing what you come up with this legislative session in your leadership position. And I hope that all of you tune into what the IOP is doing. We actually have an event in 2 weeks. I'm going to send you an email about it. Senator Charles Sidner, who represents UMBC, is a UMBC alum, and has 2 kids. He's a UMBC parent as well. He will be here if any of you are interested in following in Senator Smith's footsteps and perhaps interning in Annapolis and learning about the process front and center. We will welcome you, and we will feed you, and you can learn all about it. And you can talk to me about getting credit for your internship as well. So thank you so much, Senator Smith. And please, I ask you so much to please grab something on the way out. And that concludes our programming. Thank you.